This is the continuation of the general session. So ARPA or ARP or ARP or whatever you want to call it. It's the federal money. All right, how about that? Okay. So about yes, I'll do this. CMFO utility credits. All right, we will have a sign-up sheet for those looking for either CMFO or utility to both an hour-long credit. Afterwards, we'll be here at the table, but let them leave before you go rushing, please. And then we'll get those credits afterwards, get the signs, and make sure you get that. And also, we will provide the code for this session for those playing the game. As soon as this concludes, I'll come back and provide the code. With that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Stewart.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for taking a little more time out of your day to learn a little about our local government programs through the ARP. Let me tell you just format-wise what we're planning on doing. We went over a lot of the programs this morning. We're going to touch just briefly on the program, and then we really want to open it up for questions, thoughts from you. So be thinking about that, and then we'll just have a dialogue from each of you. We're going to start with the local government program. Sarah Freeman with Horn will walk us through that, and then we'll move on to, I think, broadband and water.
Last Commissioner Stewart said we are really just kind of hitting the high level. So we have spoken about most of this already today. But the state is running this local government technical assistance program in recognition of the additional burdens that come with being a direct recipient of the federal government. And so really that's just the goal, is to help you with those additional items, that additional challenge presented by you being the one who holds that ultimate responsibility for determining if these funds will be used for eligible expenses and in compliance with all federal regulations. So this program will just ensure that you'll have access to consistent communication from the state, and then tools for planning and implementing your ARPA funds. This program will be free and open to all counties, large metropolitan cities, and non-title unions. So it doesn't matter if you got your funds directly from Treasury or if you're receiving it as a pass-through from the state. And it will consist of a 10-week webinar series. We had the first of those webinars last Wednesday. We covered kind of an overview of ARPA and an overview of your responsibilities when it comes to these funds. If you do not have a chance to attend, we encourage you to go visit the FNA website and watch the recording of that webinar. We'll go over the remainder of those webinars in just a second. If you would like to register, if you've not registered yet, that registration link is also on the FNA website. This technical assistance program will also consist of an eligibility review of the student. So Ashley spoke a little bit about this earlier today, and it's essentially where you provide a listing of all of your projects that you want to fund using these dollars, and saying, this is why this is a necessary expense due to COVID-19, this is why we want to do this. And then some additional elements that are going to be required for treasury reporting. And our team will come and take a look at that for you and say, here's what we think is most likely eligible, here's what we think may not be, here's what requires some additional information, here's where you're probably running into some risky gray areas, and you're going to have to make a decision as a local government if you're willing to take that risk on or not. And like I mentioned before, this does not transfer liability to the state. The local government will still be responsible for making those ultimate determinations. And then additionally, there will be ongoing communications from the state via the FRS website and monthly newsletter. So next week, we will be covering, or this week I guess, on Wednesday, we will be covering treasury reporting requirements. We're going to focus mainly on this upcoming project and expenditure report. What information do you need to collect for that? there is a 10/31 reporting deadline, and I know that there are probably a lot of questions about that's coming up quickly. I don't have my funds yet. How does this apply to me? And we're going to address that as best we can on the webinar on Wednesday. Additionally, we'll be joined by TDEC on the 29th to talk some more about water and sewer infrastructure and broadband on October 6th. Then we'll do a deep dive into the remaining eligibility categories. And in that final webinar, we will cover more in depth that spend plan template and how to use it to develop your local government spend plan and how to submit that to SAFE for review. Hello, good to see you all again. As I talked about in the general session, we'll be talking about some of the broadband programs. So $500 million has been designated for these projects, $400 million for infrastructure in unserved areas, and $100 million for adoption. And we've been talking about the deadlines a lot, so not having to spend funds until the end of 2026. But since this is pandemic related, we're wanting to really get broadband and access out there as soon as possible. So we are most likely in ECD going to impose a shorter deadline. Those broadband projects will be about 3-year projects, so wanting to really get people connected as soon as possible. And the other thing that's been mentioned time and time again is awaiting the final rule from U.S. Treasury. So that is why we still have don't have some details yet. I'm a visual learner, so this is basically everything I said, but in a nice, pretty chart. Hopefully it'll be helpful for y'all as well. So that first part with the accessibility, that's the infrastructure part. The 2 buckets I mentioned, distressed county. It's not just distressed, it's going to be at-risk counties as well, and that really falls in line with Governor Lee's executive order about focusing on distressed and at-risk counties. So any applications that are going to provide that ubiquitous coverage in those areas will be given prioritization, and then the local match as well. And then those adoption programs, the low-cost internet program, that's the first one on there, which is on there as residential service subsidy. We're going to put about $50 million into that program. And if you're familiar with the FCC's Lifeline program, or they also recently rolled something out called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, it's really meant to emulate that and take its place once it runs out. With the current federal infrastructure bill, they are talking about making the EBB permanent. And if that happens, then these funds will just be reallocated into the infrastructure portion. The next part, the last 2 in adoption, as I said, can be put together in sort of that community connectivity bucket. So that's just trying to connect all these community anchor institutions, and that has a formal definition, but we're really expanding that to any sort of gathering place that providers would like to apply for. And then one other program I did not mention was, it's in our same department in economic and community development. It's with our community development and block grants. I'm sure you are very familiar with that, CDBG. They are using a portion of their funds to connect the public housing in these cities. So that's another program that we'll be doing in our department as well, and that's working with the providers. And then these are our next steps and recommendations for what should happen. We've been hearing from providers a lot about places they're already thinking about applying for, putting together these areas. And we really want that to be, that communication to be a 2-way street with the providers and the communities. Make sure you're really getting those areas that need it and that are unserved. Discuss those problem areas or issues, and then, as I said, we'll be encouraging a local community match. I think something that should be mentioned is due to some of the procurement guidelines that are coming out with these funds, communities may be required to conduct an RFP to identify that provider partner. But that's the broadband programs, and then I'll give it over to Kendra.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending today's session. Hopefully hopefully we can answer some of your questions, and as Eugene mentioned earlier, we look forward to hearing your thoughts, feedback, and all the great questions we know that you're going to put on the table. So today I'm going to briefly talk about the state-administered portion of funds that we'll be dedicating to water infrastructure. And again, I'll reiterate a lot of the points this morning and then hopefully dive into a few more details. So I wanted to kick this off by, again, reminding each of you of the water, wastewater, and stormwater eligibility as identified in that interim final rule. Again, as you heard ad nauseum today, we're waiting on that final rule, but just wanted to make sure I put some of those frequently encountered investments that are currently eligible under state revolving fund programs. This is not the state revolving fund program that we're talking about here, but eligibility as proposed by Treasury does align with that. So here you'll see the wide array of different types of projects that you may be able to finance with these funds. And this is the same eligibility both for our state administered ARP dollars as well as those local ARP dollars you may be receiving. This morning I also talked about our approach to funds distribution, and I realized that I failed to include actually our third tier strategy, which is our cleanup strategy, that's competitive grants. We won't speak a lot about that today, but spend most of our time on that formula-based grant approach. So we're really taking three different strategies. The first is the formula-based non-competitive grants. The vast majority of these funds will go out through that mechanism. Second are the state strategic projects. Those will be primarily led by the state or an entity that we choose to contract with on an enterprise level. And then again, our cleanup strategy for any funds that aren't used either via those formula-based grants or state strategic projects will be eligible for competitive grants during a second phase. I also wanted to quickly touch on some of the priorities that we are choosing to emphasize at the state level because, again, we deem these as high return on investment projects, really smart and strategic uses of funds that are going to set communities up for long-term success. And while we're talking about these priorities in the context of this granting program, I want to emphasize that these have been priorities for the state for quite some time, as well as our partners, including Economic and Community Development, the Comptroller's Office, and others at the federal and local level. So this is really a culmination of conversations that have occurred over many, many years. So here on this slide, you'll see various different priorities that we strategically included into the design of our program. And so I'm not going to read all of them for you, but you can see it touches on a variety of different potential action areas. And where these come into play is when we are asking for proposals from counties for the formula-based grants, we will require that at least 3 of these priorities are touched on. We've talked earlier about, again, how smart investing in, for example, asset management planning or water loss and infiltration and inflow reductions can be. And so we really don't see that as a challenging or difficult requirement to meet, but that's primarily where you'll see these priorities play out. But again, trying to give local governments flexibility to choose projects that are of greatest need to their communities. So a little bit more on those formula-based non-competitive grants. Again, we'll be releasing draft allocation amounts with our draft infrastructure investment plan. As I briefly noted this morning, about $200 million of those dollars are going to be equally distributed amongst all counties, and then $800 million of those dollars will be distributed based on population within a county area. So that was our way of, again, making sure everyone was touched by these funds and then providing funding roughly commensurate with customers served within an area. I do want to note that we recognize that county boundaries do not often, and in fact very rarely, align quite nicely with utility or water system service areas. So we know that, and we are trying to be very strategic in terms of how we design these program requirements to make sure we're encouraging collaboration between counties, locals, and utilities. And so again, those are elements that are kind of baked in to our proposal requirements. And I've already had some great conversations with many of you today about how we're trying to mitigate and ensure that local governments and utility systems all operating within a county are treated kind of equivalently throughout this process. The last item I will quickly quickly touch on is a good match requirement. So as you heard from state leadership this morning, it's very important to us that we are leveraging local dollars and investments in these projects. And so we will be requiring a match. We're anticipating that that will range between 20 and 40%, and that will be determined based on our ability to pay index. So this is a tool that our state revolving fund program has been using for several years now that takes into consideration economic and demographic indicators of a community to, again, determine their ability to pay. And so, again, it'll either be 20, 30, or 40% match as proposed based on that index that we've been working with the University of Tennessee on. And then I quickly wanted to touch on the state strategic projects and competitive projects as well, or competitive grants as well. The one primary and I think state strategic project that we're most excited about and very much focusing intently on right now are those infrastructure scorecards for all utilities. So this is our one confirmed state strategic project that we are fully investing in and actively working on right now to deploy and execute. And as I mentioned this morning, this is going to be a partnership project with the Tennessee Association of Utility Districts. They're in the process of updating that scorecard. You can access the current version on our website, but don't get too excited about it because there will be a version 2.0 coming out in November, and that's actually the version that we're requiring systems to complete. So you can get acquainted with it, but there will be some additions and changes. So that is really that first project we're focusing on. I've also listed here several other potential state strategic projects. Each of those will touch local governments and communities in various ways, and some of them are going to be dependent on ultimate eligibility as determined in the final rule. So we're really not emphasizing from the state's perspective as much time and energy on executing those state strategic projects outside of that infrastructure scorecard until we receive confirmation on that final rule. So more details will come out about each of those at some point in the future. Afterwards, or perhaps as part of a question in our session later today, I'd be happy to expand on any of these if they pique your interest or you'd like more details. And then finally, as I noted, we have a cleanup strategy. So any funds that aren't spent down as part of that $1 billion pot of funds that will go out to counties in the form of non-competitive grants or in these state strategic projects, we plan on issuing a competitive granting process to again allow communities to take advantage of additional funding should they have an excess and still unmet needs for their water infrastructure needs across the state. Oh, that's timely, I apologize. Quickly wanted to touch on our anticipated timeline. This slide was actually a lot prettier prior to last week, and I'll blame it on Eugene. He shared with me the awesome news about Treasury's final rule being delayed slightly. I'm just kidding, that's not Eugene's fault. It was still small before. But the biggest change I think in our timeline is that everything is kind of now dependent upon finalization until we receive that final rule. And again, in the same way we want you all to make smart investments, we want to do the same at the state level. But real quickly, I'm going to share with you the sequence of events. Again, I think exact timeline is outstanding, but I'll just tell you a little bit about how we see things sequencing through. So once we do receive that U.S. Treasury final rule, we will put forth a draft water infrastructure investment plan. That's where you'll see intimate details about our proposed plans. It should very closely align with what you're seeing and hearing today, albeit in far greater detail. So we plan to put that out and make it open for public comment. I mentioned earlier that partnerships are incredibly important, and so we want to hear from you what's going to work, what isn't going to work, and what are some tweaks or changes that we can make to our approach that would better meet your needs. Following that, we'll close the public comment period, consider those comments, and then publish a final water infrastructure plan. That will again be kind of our strategic document that really lays out how we'll be spending these plans moving forward. Concurrent with that, we'll be continuing to hit the road, having conversations like this, hosting workshops, making sure that you and your partners are well equipped with all the information you need to be able to confidently make decisions regarding these funds. And then finally, we plan to open the process for non-competitive grants in January 2022. Again, that is highly dependent on when that final rule is finalized, so I would not be surprised if we actually push that date out. So, but I still wanted to put that date out there as something at least in the near term to work towards. And then finally, I wanted to go into some additional detail on that infrastructure scorecard. So again, this is the partner project we're working on with the Tennessee Association of Utility Districts. Each utility or water system in the state that serves municipal or domestic drinking water, wastewater, or stormwater needs will be required to complete one of these. And so you'll see on this slide the actual website where the scorecard can be accessed. So this is a tool and a resource that we've put out there to support systems in basically diagnosing and providing a snapshot of their financial, environmental, and operational health. And so we see this as a foundational tool that can be hugely helpful and informative as communities work with their systems to determine how to strategically spend these funds. So I suggested earlier that we've identified several different project categories that we deem as high return on investment projects. That's our listing of sort of core project areas we'd like you to address, and this tool will help you figure out which of those are our greatest concern and greatest opportunity for your community. So the version 2.0, the one that we are going to be requiring utilities to complete, will be released in November. And it's not just a scorecard that we're putting out there, we're actually engaging in robust technical assistance with TAUD to actually make that a really easy tool to use for communities. So TAUD, starting in November, will be hosting a series of trainings intended for the larger systems across the state, as well as a series of workshops that are going to be more hands-on opportunities for systems to be walked through completion of that tool. So we anticipate that at most for systems, this is not going to be more than, a 3-hour commitment of time, and hugely informative again in diagnosing the health of their system and where opportunity areas really are. That technical assistance will again start in November and run approximately through December. I wanted to quickly touch on some of the changes. If you do have a chance to visit that website, and these are just screen captures of different tabs. It's an Excel-based sheet at this point in time. Some of the cells are locked, some you include inputs on. But some of the critical changes and additions that you'll see in the version 2.0 compared to the version that's on our website right now is addition of compliance and enforcement information, stormwater management, risk and resiliency, thresholds for certain measures that again will sort of trigger you to say, okay, I need to engage in a project to address water loss, because I know that's a significant environmental resource loss and financial problem for my system. And so we want to invest in one of those projects. And so be on the lookout for those changes coming in the future. The last thing I will quickly note is that, again, on the topic of engagement and regular participation with you all as stakeholders, we have formed an invitation-only Water Infrastructure Advisory Committee, and that group is going to be meeting approximately bi-monthly, really over the duration of this water infrastructure granting process. And we have several folks representing local government interests on that group. We have representatives from MTAS, from the Tennessee County Services Association, and then we also have representatives from both large and small drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. And so if any of you all are interested in, again, being connected with those representatives or want to discuss ways to get more involved in that process, please come see me after this presentation. That's what I got.
All right, so as I mentioned, really want to hear from you, questions. So, yes, sir.
I have one. So I'm from a very small city. You got to pay this little money. And everything I hear is we could spend on wastewater, and stuff of that nature, but $100,000 guys is not going to give me 30 for the bike. I'm not, that's what creative ideas can I look for to spend? Because I don't want the state to take $100,000 from me, because I'm trying to spend my head around it. The cybersecurity, I found something like that's $3,000. I think I got when you have $100,000 and everybody knows it's green, that's going to fix maybe a 10-mile pipe. And that's not changing, life-changing stuff for your citizens. And I have broadband. We're very fortunate that Gibson Electric ran broadband throughout pretty much our entire county. So that's out of the question. Other than Wi-Fi, we don't have businesses that shoot that down to. So, you know, I'm running out of ideas. I have an idea, but I haven't seen that that's the right.
So one thing that I would encourage, so it's a great question, so for just on the room, limited amount of funds based on a small city, and so what can you do with those funds that provides meaningful investment into your community? One thing I would suggest is taking apart, participating in the webinar series. One of the things we did that we saw that was helpful and successful as part of the CARES Act, CRF webinar series that we did was, as we talk about eligibility, we'll talk about some examples. Now, use and eligibility is going to be facts and circumstance specific, so just because something's eligible in one local government doesn't necessarily mean that it will be eligible in another. But I don't have a direct answer for you, but that's one thing that I would suggest doing is making sure you listen in on those webinars, because once we get to eligibility, we will start talking about some examples.
That's one problem I have with the webinars. They're posted at 11 o'clock, and I would say part-time maybe where I put in more hours than a lot. It's 11 o'clock I can work. Then I've got to go back and watch them, and I can ask those questions in the webinar. So I'm stuck.
So we do have, and I'll let Ashley and Sarah maybe talk to some either questions that we've already received, maybe some examples of what they're seeing in some of the other states or local governments that they're supporting. But we do have a email address, tnarpa.support@Horn LLP. While that's primarily right now intended to help with logging into the portal and that, we have received those questions. I've received some of those questions. We are trying to field those questions, either answer them or roll those into our webinar series. So I would encourage you, if you want to talk about your specific issue, maybe after this, or shoot us an email to me, to the support.
So one quick, it dawned on me, I think it's a great observation, question. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. I know one thing that we've thought quite a bit about in the water infrastructure world, but I also heard it mentioned today by our speaker from the National League of Cities, was thinking regionally about solutions. And so I think one opportunity area may be to speak to nearby communities and understand how they're investing their funds, and there may be easy ways to kind of tag on or connect to their proposals that may allow each of your independent communities to leverage dollars collectively and perhaps have a more significant impact with a larger scale project. And so, again, in the water infrastructure context, we would encourage you to think regionally about solutions rather than just solely in your community. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well, that I think could be applicable across all spending categories.
Would you not also qualify this $100,000 to match?
100%, yep. I mean, not 100% match, but yes. Totally would qualify, yes. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. One more of a comment. I appreciate the interest in seeing the counties a few times now allocate that adequately and fairly, but just an observation that they don't really see the city as somebody to collaborate with. They see it as competition, so they take the line of leaving us out. So you keep that in mind. Secondarily, we are on the priority ranking list for SRF, and we're very appreciative of that. However, as you know, the timing is rolling. We love SRF, we were more happy to do that, but if we're going to get free federal government money, love to do that, but we don't want to be a bad neighbor of that program. We want to be fair about that. How do we approach that? How do we not make somebody mad and get on the,
So I'll address your second question first and then
Sure.
hop back to the first. So for the second question, one of the state strategic projects that we've included is what we're calling a new SRF or a new loan incentive. And so we're taking actually some of our ARP dollars to clear those and essentially offer, kind of lower the overall loan amount, offer some principal forgiveness to communities that are actively engaged in that process. So I share that with you to say we recognize that this infusion of funds is likely to cause sort of a short-term preference for taking advantage of grant funds as opposed to loan funds. And so we understand that. Paula Mitchell, right here, my colleague, actually oversees that program, and so I encourage you to connect with her. But that's something we thought through, and we have budgeted some funding in for that. So exactly how that plays out, we're still working through those details, but we're aware of that, and we want to make sure that communities who have projects that are part of that program still have some incentive to stick with that program if it works out well for you. As it relates to city and kind of county government dynamics, the feedback you're sharing is not new, so we've heard that, and I hear your concerns and thank you for sharing it. A couple of things that we are thinking through as part of our program design and application process is how can we strongly encourage that collaboration to happen as part of the process. And so, for example, some of the strategies that I've shared with you all earlier today when you posed this question is when we are reviewing a county's proposal for use of funds. So just because it's a non-competitive grant doesn't mean we're just going to give it to you. We're actually going to ask each county to give us a listing of projects that it's proposing to fund with its non-competitive grant allocation. We'll be reviewing and approving that before we disperse those funds. But as part of that proposal process and review process, we will be asking each county to offer a letter of support for any entity that's operating a drinking water, wastewater, or stormwater system. So we'll be asking for that letter of support to be included as part of that proposal. And beyond that, anytime we do not see a system that we know is operating in that county or serving a portion of that county that is not somehow addressed in that proposal, we're going to ask that question. And so we're trying to bake in, the other thing I'll share is that we are very strongly thinking about putting forth a recommended planning process. We don't want to be prescriptive in that because we recognize each community is unique. Some counties probably have more amicable relationships than others. I'm here, you know. And so we want to put that out there as a recommended planning process. And so that is another tool or resource that we're strongly considering developing to help support you all as well as county governments in working through that process and making sure that every system's needs are heard. So a couple different mitigating measures. I think we really appreciate some feedback on those. I saw a couple of hands. I think I saw yours first.
Let me clear my mind, please. If our county would receive the share of $200 million, you have the 800 million split population. You can take, say, the county government decided to give our town or our utilities within the county $750,000 kids, we can use that for matching on the next $800 million.
So we are requiring the match at the county level, but the county can choose to source that local match however they want. So the county may decide to come back to cities and ask for them to put a portion of the match. The county may want to take all of their local ARP allocation and put it as match. We're only worried about the county matching the direct allocation or the proportional allocation that we would be giving them. And when we look at, you heard me reference a base allocation plus a proportional, those are going to be communicated in one number. So you'll only be matching that one number. So let's put a hypothetical, let's say your base, which is 2 million plus 10 million in proportional allocation. So you're looking at 12 million as a county, and we would ask a county to match between 20 and 40% of that. And that's the only match number we're worried about.
Okay, so you can't match on the first 200 million. You can't take that money and match.
No, you can't match our ARP dollars with other ARP dollars. But the local direct allocations can be used as match. So any money that a community is getting directly from Treasury, not passed through the state's program, or not passed through the state administered program, can be source of match.
And as far as TDEC is concerned, any eligible SRA project is what you're looking for, right?
Again, that would be sort of circumstance specific, but for the most part, SRF eligibility mirrors what eligibility would look like under this program.
Well, on TDEC scorecard.
Projects aren't scored on the scorecard, it's the operations of the system that are scored on the scorecard. The operations and the condition of the asset that is scored on the scorecard.
TDEC one from the individual.
So we will have that.
Thank you.
Either of them, we got two over here.
I would strongly encourage you to have guidelines, criteria on how the county evaluates projects. In our county, for example, there's 8 municipalities plus the county. And in $20, that doesn't go very well for kids' child. That's really concerning.
Okay. It's a good suggestion. Go ahead.
I think I had to straighten out confused. If we use our initial allocation as match,
Your local allocation that you get directly from Treasury can be, and in fact, we highly encourage that.
okay, and we switched to number 23rd, 40. Little did we know that, so that we could plan the magnitude of our project.
We've discussed releasing that with the draft infrastructure investment plan. I will share with you that there is also a parallel conversation saying folks need more information sooner. We actually have that list. We just have not posted it. So we're in conversations with FNA, Governor's Office, Comptroller's Office about comfort sharing that, knowing again that this is all draft in nature and subject to change. There was one in this area.
Sorry, his question was the additional money, is that what he asked?
His question was, again, is any funding that, he just wanted to again confirm that any funding that governments are receiving directly from Treasury is their local allocations, that those can be sourced of match, and they can.
Commissioner, earlier today, you talked about these funds you matched with the 75% of the budget. Was that the general fund or the individual enterprise funds or the total funds?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So it's, I believe it's the total funds. I'm looking to the back row, comptrollers are not there. So it's total funds of your budget. But again, we have, if you've logged into the portal or if you haven't, we have provided the budget number that we just need you to either confirm or if something significantly changed. So, and I believe we have the budget documents linked for all non-entitlement units, small cities, so you can actually see the budget document that we have used to arrive at that budget number.
And I just want to piggyback on that and say that those budget numbers were the budget that was in effect as of January 7th, 2020, and that was dictated by U.S. Treasury. So we have received some questions around, well, we have an approved 2022 budget, we're not using that, and that was dictated by Treasury that we were using those numbers as of January 27th, 2020.
Yes, sir.
Next question about logistics of resources and time. It sounds like, it looks like there could be a lot of cities in the state, in counties, that's jumping on water problems. Is there enough piping? Is there enough people to do the labor? Within this, what's that, 3-year window?
3-year obligate, 5-year, 2026 to fully
Even
expend.
5 years. I mean, it sounds like a major project throughout the state. I mean, are we going to do this?
No, it's a great question, and we've had those conversations ourselves.
Yeah, so as Eugene mentioned, again, it's a great flag. We're concerned about it. We know you all are concerned about it. A couple of things. So I mentioned our Infrastructure Advisory Committee, our Water Infrastructure Advisory Committee. We have several representatives that are representing utility construction firms as well as engineering and consulting firms. And so kind of the resounding message that we're hearing is that, yes, we know there are supply chain issues that have been exacerbated by COVID, and this will even further exacerbate those. However, it just may take some time for markets to kind of recalibrate and redistribute resources, but also that they feel the opportunity is so great that it should not be a reason for us not to invest these dollars in this way. We have also considered, so I mentioned state strategic projects. We've also tried to think through, again, what actions would be appropriate within the state's purview to take to try to lessen those impacts. And so one of the areas, it's not necessarily construction related in terms of project execution, but one area where we thought about, can we provide further technical assistance lift from again, our perspective in investing those dollars, is through potentially offering a contract for technical assistance should local governments have trouble making their arrangements of their own to, again, find an engineer or consultant to help them execute projects. So that's something we're considering. And then finally, I think the other thing I'll note is that there's a whole host of eligible planning and design and also kind of remediation projects that we wouldn't consider necessarily specialized in terms of needing specialized supplier labor. So anything you're doing sort of in the water loss planning, comprehensive asset management, or even water loss diagnosis space may not require a specialized contractor. And so one thing we're already thinking through is how can we develop a list of qualified contractors and sort of the specific types of projects that even if they're not a specialized like water plant construction firm, how can we help connect communities with those resources that may be able to execute projects on a faster timeline. So I know that's not a perfect answer to your question, but we're aware of it and we're thinking about it. The other thing I will say, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling, but I'm getting new thoughts in my head as I go.
Big cities are gonna get it.
Yeah.
Small cities, we're gonna get the end of that.
Well, the other thing we're hearing is we're actually farther along in the planning process than other states. And our hope is that if there is a large future infrastructure bill, we will have jump-started our process before that. So hopefully, even though there are delays, we won't be at the very end of the line.
Couple of things on more practical level. If we dig up water lines to replace them with sewer lines, everything, now we got to fix the street. Is the street thing going to be considered a acceptable use of that? And also, if we use internal labor, can we cap that labor just like we put a contract?
So I think, again, those are going to be circumstance-specific considerations, and we'll have to, again, understand how directly, sort of replacing and fixing that street is with the associated project. So again, that'll be kind of a case-by-case.
Well, you can't dig up a water line and replace it out there in the street.
Mm-hmm.
That's just going to be part and parcel.
Yeah, again, I don't know if that's a question we're prepared to answer directly today without looking at the specific project. So I think it's a great thing for us to look into and try to figure out kind of what guideposts can we share with you all to give you some level of confidence as to what could be fundable or approvable and what couldn't.
What about the labor question?
The labor question, that's something we're actively considering as well. Is again, so I can tell you that I think we would consider in-house labor as a source of funding that we can support. Again, we're going to need additional information about it, but I have no reason to believe that we couldn't provide funding for that if you're doing work in-house. It would just kind of be in your budget. It would appear in your budget.
As far as the logistics of getting a project underway, is our local bidding process going to be okay? TDOT has different bidding processes than my city does, so whatever we do would be.
Yeah, we have no intentions of imposing upon you all any bidding process that's different from what you would already use. The other area where I think this question has come up is is our process going to allow you to circumvent any sort of local commission or budgetary approvals? And it would not. One thing we are also thinking in the vein of developing resources that can help support local governments and utilities here is template MOAs or MOUs that would sort of help facilitate, again, this execution of funds and these subrecipient relationships. And so to the extent that communities already have those developed, or may have used certain documents in the context of, for example, community development block grants, we know that's an area where it isn't uncommon for a county to pass through funds to a utility. We're planning on developing those types of templates and documents to make it more plug and play for you.
And engineering costs can be considered in.
Yeah, planning and design and engineering costs up to a certain amount are eligible. Paula, I'm gonna look at you to sort of help me weigh in on. I caveated that with up to a certain amount.
Yeah, we have talked internally about the potential of what does reasonable engineering cost or construction cost look like and how we would respond to that. And while we haven't fleshed that out quite yet to share widely, it is on our mind as well.
Because these larger infrastructure, water and sewer projects, my city can't do this. We're gonna have to contract it out, but I need an engineer. I mean, that's.
And typically those costs are negotiated by the engineer as a percentage of the overall project cost. I think where we're worried about reasonableness is we don't want to see situations where engineers and consultants are routinely priced gouging local government. So that reasonableness is intended to protect and provide a buffer for you all, not make it harder for you all, or not to put you in a situation when you're not going to be reimbursed for costs. So that's when we use the term reasonable, what we're really trying to get out there. Question?
Would the state consider using one of the typical price curves for professional services as just a bill by?
We have talked about that as it relates to, I think, some federal funding programs. And so it's on our radar screen. I think if you have recommendations for price curves that you yourselves have found reasonable and, a good source, we'd definitely be open to that.
Okay.
So please share that with us. Back first, then front. Yep, you please start.
There's been a lot of thought, obviously, I think everybody in the room has a project in mind, water and sewer capacity perspective. What kind of resources are going to be available at the state level to ensure an expedited permitting, review process so that these projects quickly become shovel-ready and executed within the timeline? Have you all thought through?
We have. It's a great question. We haven't been speaking about it as much or at length with external audiences, but we do have an entire sort of parallel operational plan that we really haven't discussed at all here. And so in addition to the funds that we talked about today, there's a significant source of funding. It's actually about 7% of overall ARP dollars that are being dedicated to water infrastructure projects at the state level that we're dedicating to administration. So it's really important to us that we are providing necessary sources of support for, as you noted, plans review, permitting, project management on our end, subrecipient monitoring, auditing that's different from local government auditing, but sort of project auditing, all of those things. And so, again, we are having robust conversations with FNA in particular about the best arrangement there. And so it will actually be a combination. What we're discussing right now is augmentation of in-house resources plus outsourcing to contractors. As you all, I'm sure, understand, there are certain functions that we must perform as the state's regulatory agency, and we cannot outsource by law, nor could we do that because it might present a conflict of interest. But those that we can outsource, we are highly likely to. We're considering a global RFP for that, but we are also not against individual RFPs for that. So that is how we're spending a great deal of our time right now to make sure we're adequately suited to administer this significant program. Oh, you first.
When you're talking about engineering costs and administrative consultants for contracts, are you talking about those contracts have to be approved
The contracts themselves that you may enter into with a third party to execute your project are not something that we would necessarily have to approve. We would be approving your proposed scope of work, not as part of that contract that you're planning on engaging in, as well as any other regulatory documents such as your plans or offering permits that you may be required to get as part of that. But we would not be reviewing contracts, to my knowledge.
So I guess to Chuck's question or point, and the other gentleman over in the other side of the room, regarding funds that may already soft cost be underway or designed work with TDAC for a new plant, things of that nature, which would have been, and maybe this is more of a follow-up question, in the 2020 budget, and therefore perhaps preceding some of this. Will that retroactively potentially be reimbursable?
So that's a discussion we're having internally. The Treasury interim final rule, as long as it's an eligible expenditure, I think if it's happened after March 19th, 2020, March 3rd, sorry, today's March 3rd of 2021, actually says that that would technically be eligible, and we are thinking for the purposes of easing with alignment of that interim final rule that we would consider those. With the caveat that we have certain state procurement requirements that in certain circumstances would not allow us to reimburse certain types of expenditures that occur outside the term of a grant contract. So we're working as hard as we can to make sure that those types of expenditures would be covered. But again, we're trying to make sure that we're appropriately considering all of the other requirements that we're bound by in state procurement and contracting world. So I feel like I'm giving you an answer, non-answer, but I'm trying to tell you and be transparent about what we know at this point.
Yeah, so we're talking water, sewer, stormwater. I think for most of us, easily define what's water, what's sewer, pipes, plants, pump stations. Stormwater means a lot of different things in a lot of different communities. There's going to be some clear guidance. Does it have to be a water quality component to whatever you're doing, or can it be maintenance, flood prevention, that kind of stuff?
Your ears must have been burning this morning at 6 o'clock. So Paula and I had this conversation on the drive up, and there have been several communities that have voiced a desire to have greater clarity on where stormwater management ends and where just kind of flood management begins, and how far will SRF eligibilities and also eligibility under this program stretch. And so there is guidance at the federal level out on this associated with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And so our plan is to not only make sure we're highlighting that guidance, but also kind of distill it down into project examples to be able to share with you all. But we know that's an area where we need to offer some additional clarity. Paula, anything you want to add to that? Okay.
Just to follow, he hasn't asked this question before.
Okay, you go first.
I'm also from a small city. We don't have our own utility company. We piggyback off of the neighboring utility company, which is very large, largest city in our county. And I take my money, go through the neighboring city's utility company, but designate that money to use within our city. And the same thing with the county. And I make sure the county that we get our share of the money, even though we're a smaller city within that county.
For water and wastewater infrastructure projects, I think you can use that, your local dollars towards water and wastewater infrastructure however you see fit. And so partnering or transferring those funds to the system that operates in your community is how you want to spend those dollars. Yes, you can. Likewise, under our program, if you want to choose to leverage, or if you know that there are water infrastructure improvements that need to happen in your community, and that area is managed or served by a utility, that's where I would encourage you to start having those conversations so that when we are considering distribution of funds to counties, which in most cases or in many cases will then be subbed down to utility systems or water systems, just to make sure that your needs in your community are part of sort of that running list of project needs. So again, one thing we're even encouraging utilities to start thinking through is once you complete completed that infrastructure scorecard, or even before then, if you want to start doing it now, identify your top 3 water infrastructure projects and talk to your county about it. Put it on their radar screen. That may not be exactly what you end up, giving them in terms of documentation to help flesh out that county's proposal. But I think you'd be doing them a huge favor if you go ahead and say, look, these are the top 3 projects that I know need to be funded in my community. Here's the utility or the water system that operates where these projects need to occur, and we would really like to see this as part of the county's proposal.
We surrender, and I don't know if surrender is the right term, but if our money goes to the neighboring city's utility company, would we still qualify for the match since we would technically not be doing the work ourselves?
So what that would look like in that circumstance is you would want to make sure that the county you operate in is aware of you dedicating those funds in that way, so it can qualify as, because again, we're looking at the match on the county level, because we are going to give X dollars to a form of non-competitive grant to this county to administer. And so if they're looking at making a 20% match of that dollar amount, they're going to want to know if you're already investing dollars into an infrastructure project. So that works in their favor. Right there and then there. No.
A quick question, follow up on talking about retro payments. So if you had something done March 3rd, is that with the dates? We had a project that happened in February that cost the city substantial amount of money. We didn't pay for it until June. So with that fall,
Guys.
The Treasury has dealt with this in their recent FAQs about what does it mean to have a cost incurred as of March 3rd, of 2020. And so it's okay if the project was contemplated or began before March 3rd, but the costs that you're using your ARPA dollars to pay for, those can't have been incurred. So part of that project, the cost could have been obligated prior to March 3rd. You can't use your ARPA dollars to operate that. But if there's additional costs that were, then you can use it.
that's what I was just wondering where.
Yeah.
You use the term county generically. Is this going to the county mayor's desk? Is it going to the county commission? Is the state proposing committees to be established for the allocation of this money?
We have intended these funds to go through county government. Do you have a preference, or what are your thoughts on each of those different approaches that you noted?
I could speak for that. I think the committee would be better than one individual or maybe the county commission.
Okay.
This will be a technical allocation of the project, evaluating the money.
Our evaluation will be slightly different than technical in the sense that those of you who have encountered an SRF project before will be, in that we're not ranking projects. We're taking county proposals and making sure A, they fit within the allocated budget, B, that it aligns with the eligible uses that we've laid out in our program, C, that again, they've received letters of support from utility systems and cities operating within their boundaries, and that also they propose to touch at least every system operating in their county. But we're not prioritizing or ranking or scoring projects beyond that. Does that help? So there will be, in our application, we are talking about more narrative-based proposals than we have historically seen.
We're over time. We had, this is a quick question, and then we can hang around. I know there's another session right after this one. We can hang around for a few minutes in here or right outside. I know we got to wrap up.
The county got their allocation, the city got their allocation. When you say the county, often dollar money in the rural areas that obviously they got the dollar money.
In the context of our state program or with their local allocations? With their local, I'm going to cut back. Do they have to actually use? No, I don't think, because I think they can see it to others. But that may be a better one question.
Yeah, if we're not speaking water, so we're not specifically water.
so that you have more funds available to get that project. That's perfectly fine to work with the county, we work with other jurisdictions. That's perfectly fine to do that. You're all, it's right, you're all the representatives, you've all got your own updates.
Yeah, one thing I would say, and this goes certainly for water sewer, but other projects, is, look regionally, within your area.